For 25 years, my wife's family had a quiet little nickname for me, one they thought I never knew about, the opportunist. They were convinced from the very first dinner I ever had at their table that I'd married into the Whitfield family for one reason only, the money. My name is Walter Hayes. I grew up the son of a machinist in a working-class neighborhood, the kind of background that gets summarized in one sentence at fancy dinner parties, and then quietly moved past. I met my wife, Elizabeth Whitfield, 27 years ago at a community engineering exposition, where I was presenting a manufacturing process I'd developed myself, fresh out of graduate school. Elizabeth's family owned Whitfield and Sons, a furniture manufacturing company her grandfather had built into a regional institution over 60 years. Old money by local standards, not enormous by national comparisons, but enormous in our town, where the Whitfield name was practically a synonym for successful. Elizabeth brought me home for the first time. Her mother, Margaret, looked me up and down like she was appraising a second-hand car. Older brother, Richard, was more direct about it, cornering me in the kitchen during that first dinner to ask, almost cheerfully, "So, what exactly do you bring to this besides charm?" Elizabeth 2 years later anyway, despite, or honestly, partly because of, how little her family thought of me. She never cared about any of it. She married me because she loved me, full stop, and she made that clear to her family more than once over the following decades. But the whispers never really stopped. At every holiday dinner, every anniversary party, every milestone birthday, there was always a version of the same comment, delivered just quietly enough to seem accidental. "It's nice that Walter's done so well for himself, marrying into this family." 25 years of it. I stopped correcting people somewhere around year 10. What the Whitfield family never bothered to ask, because they'd already decided what kind of man I was before I ever opened my mouth, was what that manufacturing process I'd presented at that engineering expo 27 years ago had actually turned into. It was a process for treating composite wood materials that, as it turned out, became a small but steady industry standard over the following 2 decades. I licensed the patent to several manufacturers, including, ironically, a few of Whitfield and Sons' own competitors. The royalties were modest in the early years, but they compounded quietly, year after year, into a private trust. I never made a point of discussing at family dinners. I took a regular engineering job at Whitfield and Sons itself shortly after marrying Elizabeth, partly to be close to the family business, partly because I genuinely liked the work. I never asked for a title bump because of my marriage. I never angled for a board seat. I just did the job, collected a normal salary, and let the family believe whatever story was easiest for them to tell about why I was there. Margaret and Richard, over the years, built an entire narrative around that choice, that I'd married in because I couldn't make it on my own, that the Whitfield name was the only real value I'd ever bring to the table. I let them believe it. Honestly, it was simpler than constantly defending myself to people who'd already made up their minds. Elizabeth knew the full truth about my patent and the trust, obviously. She also respected deeply that I didn't want to use it as a weapon in arguments with her family. "Let them think what they want," she told me more than once. "We know the truth. That's enough." What I also knew, quietly, through my own role at the company, was something the wider family didn't fully grasp. Whitfield and Sons had been struggling for years. Richard had taken over as CEO a decade earlier and made a series of expansion decisions, new factories, aggressive debt-financed growth that hadn't paid off the way he'd promised the family. The company was carrying significantly more debt than most relatives realized, and profits had been declining for 6 straight years. My father-in-law, Charles Whitfield, knew this better than anyone. In his final 2 years, visibly frail but sharp as ever, he started having long conversations with me specifically, not Richard, not Margaret, about the actual state of the business. I think, in his own way, he'd started to see something in me the rest of the family had spent 25 years refusing to look at. About 8 months before he passed, Charles asked me directly whether I'd be willing to help stabilize the company financially if it came to that, in exchange for a formal ownership stake. I told him I'd think about it, mostly because I knew the second I said yes, it would become a family war I wasn't sure was worth fighting at the time. He passed away peacefully in his sleep before we ever finalized that conversation. The will reading was scheduled for 3 weeks later, and the entire extended family showed up dressed like they were attending a much more celebratory event than what was actually about to happen. The lawyer, a calm, methodical man named Preston, started with the smaller items, a few personal heirlooms, some minor cash gifts to grandchildren. Then he moved to the company. As most of you are aware, Preston said, Whitfield and Sons has carried significant operating debt for several years. Mr. Whitfield's estate, after settling outstanding obligations, holds considerably less liquid value than many of you may be expecting. Richard's face went pale. Margaret asked him to repeat that, twice. Preston continued, explaining that Charles had, in his final year, sold a meaningful percentage of his personal shares simply to keep the company's debt serviceable. Shares that, under different circumstances, would have gone directly to his children and grandchildren as inheritance. Then Preston turned to a separate document. Mr. Whitfield also left a personal letter to be read aloud regarding a private arrangement he made 8 months before his passing. The letter explained, in Charles's own words, that he'd approached his son-in-law, me, about stabilizing the company financially, and that he wanted the family to know, regardless of whether that arrangement was ever finalized, that he'd come to deeply respect the one member of this family who'd never once asked this family for anything in 25 years. Richard turned to me, somewhere between confused and defensive. Wait, stabilize it how? With what money? I hadn't planned on answering that question in that room, surrounded by people who'd spent decades calling me an opportunist behind my back. But Elizabeth squeezed my hand under the table, and I figured 25 years of silence had earned me one honest sentence. With the trust I've held privately since before I even met any of you, I said. The one funded by a patent I developed in graduate school. The one none of you ever bothered to ask me about, because you'd already decided I didn't have anything worth asking about. The room went completely silent. Margaret, for possibly the first time in 25 years, didn't have a single comment ready. I did eventually agree to help stabilize Whitfield and Sons, not as a favor to Richard, and certainly not to prove anything to Margaret, but because Charles had asked me directly, and because Elizabeth's family legacy meant something to her, even with all its complications. We restructured the ownership terms fairly, with actual legal protections this time, and Richard stayed on as CEO under a board that, for the first time in company history, included external oversight he genuinely needed. Margaret never formally apologized, not in so many words, but she stopped using the word opportunist, even as a joke, and started slowly asking actual questions about my work instead of making assumptions about it. People sometimes ask me if I regret staying quiet for 25 years instead of correcting the narrative sooner. I don't, honestly. I never married into that family for validation, and I wasn't about to start chasing it the moment I finally had the leverage to demand it. I married Elizabeth because I loved her. Everything else, the trust, the patent, the quiet decades of being underestimated, was just background noise that happened to resolve itself, eventually, exactly when it needed to. If this story got to you, next week's story is just as unexpected. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss it.